When a boy vanishes in a quiet town, Detective Arden uncovers chilling secrets hidden in the woods. Strange symbols, a faceless figure, and an abandoned shack lead to a terrifying mystery. What would you do if the clues led you somewhere you didn't want to go? Let us know! Detective Henry Arden would always remember the day the call came in. A 9-year-old boy, Mark Ellison, had vanished without a trace. His family had recently moved into a modest suburban home in Cranewood, a town known for its quiet streets and tightly knit community. Yet, it was a place where appearances deceived, and silence often masked the unspeakable. The Ellisons had arrived only 3 weeks prior, eager to start anew after leaving a bustling metropolis. Their house, an old Victorian structure at the end of a cul-de-sac, seemed the perfect setting for their fresh start. Surrounded by tall, dense oaks, the house stood apart, exuding a certain rustic charm that the Ellisons found irresistible. Neighbors described Mark as curious and friendly, the kind of child who'd eagerly explore his surroundings. But Cranewood was unfamiliar terrain, full of wooded paths and abandoned buildings that whispered secrets to anyone who dared to listen. On the day Mark went missing, the weather had been unseasonably cold, and a dense fog had rolled in, swallowing the streets in an eerie haze. His mother, distracted by unpacking and settling in, only realized his absence when the sun began to dip below the horizon. Her panicked cries alerted the neighbors, and soon the police were called. When Detective Arden arrived, the neighborhood was already a hive of frantic activity. Flashlights bobbed in the mist as volunteers combed the woods and search dogs barked, straining against their leashes. The Ellison house, bathed in the cold glow of police lights, felt alive in a way that houses shouldn't, its peeling shutters and sagging porch creaking under the weight of secrets. Inside, Arden questioned the parents. They were distraught but cooperative, describing Mark's habit of wandering and his fascination with the woods behind the house. Still, something gnawed at Arden, an itch just beneath the surface of the story. He asked to see Mark's room, hoping to learn something from the boy's belongings. The Ellisons led him upstairs, the creaking stairs amplifying the weight of their dread. The boy's room was a chaotic mix of cardboard boxes and hastily arranged furniture, but one detail seized Arden's attention immediately: a small notebook, lying open on the desk. The pages were filled with crude sketches of what appeared to be the house and the surrounding woods. Some drawings were innocent, stick figures under trees and birds in the sky, but others were more unsettling. There were repeated images of a strange figure, tall and spindly, with unnaturally long limbs and a blank oval face. It appeared to loom in doorways, linger at the edges of the woods, and crouch beneath windowsills. Arden's breath caught when he noticed something else: a crude map drawn in the notebook's back pages. It detailed paths through the woods that Mark could not have known after such a short time living there. Yet the paths were marked with unsettling precision, each leading to a single location circled heavily in black ink. Beside it, in shaky letters, the boy had written one word: home. Arden held the notebook tightly as he left the house and headed toward the woods with the search party. But the word home, and the blank face of that figure followed him like a shadow. He didn't believe in ghosts, but something about those pages whispered of something deeply wrong, something more than a child's imagination. The woods behind the Ellison house seemed endless in the heavy fog, a labyrinth of skeletal trees that twisted together like reaching arms. Detective Arden, notebook in hand, followed the crude map Mark had drawn. The search party fanned out, their shouts for the boy echoing into the oppressive quiet, but Arden barely noticed. His focus was locked on the circled spot: home. The notebook weighed heavily in his hands, its strange, uneven letters burned into his mind. The crude drawings of the blank-faced figure gnawed at his thoughts. It wasn't just a child's scrawl, it felt deliberate, like a warning or a confession. As he trudged deeper into the woods, the sounds of the search party faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. Occasionally, a snapping branch or the rustle of unseen movement would jolt him to a stop, his pulse quickening. Yet nothing emerged from the shadows. The map led him to a narrow, overgrown path, almost hidden beneath fallen leaves. Arden's boots crunched against the damp earth as he pressed forward, guided by the marked trails in the boy's sketches. Then, through the fog, he saw it, a clearing. At the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated structure, barely visible in the gray haze. It wasn't much more than a shack, its rotting wood and sagging roof betraying years of abandonment. Arden's first thought was that this couldn't be what Mark had meant by home. As he approached, he saw the faint remnants of a child's presence. A rusted tricycle overturned near the entrance, its paint flaking away, a scattering of weathered toys, too worn to have been recent. But the strangest discovery was what lay nailed to the shack's door, a small wooden sign, its letters uneven and childlike, spelling out the same word he had seen in the notebook. Home. Arden's breath caught. The boy's handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. Somehow, he had been here. But how had a child who had only lived in the town for weeks known of this forgotten place? The detective hesitated, his instincts urging caution. But something compelled him forward. He pushed open the door, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the weak light filtering through cracks in the walls. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, scraps of fabric, and what appeared to be old children's shoes, scattered as if discarded in haste. On the far wall, another discovery awaited. Scribbled in black charcoal, crude drawings covered the surface, much like those in the notebook. The same blank-faced figure loomed in every one, surrounded by stick figures of children, their arms stretched out toward it as if in worship, or surrender. At the center of the wall, in larger letters, were the words, "We found you." A chill crawled up Arden's spine. He took a step back, his boot crunching against something on the floor. Looking down, he saw a child's red shoe, dirted and worn. The initials, M.E., were scrawled on the inside, Mark Ellison's shoe. Arden froze, his hand tightening around the notebook. The boy had been here, but where was he now? And who, or what, had drawn those images? As he turned to leave, the sound of rustling came from the trees outside. It was faint, but deliberate, as though someone, or something, was circling the shack. Arden's heart pounded as he realized he wasn't alone. Detective Arden froze, straining to hear over the sound of his own pulse hammering in his ears. The rustling outside was deliberate, moving slowly, almost methodically, around the perimeter of the shack. He backed toward the doorway, his grip tightening on his flashlight, its faint beam barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. The moment he stepped out into the clearing, the forest seemed to come alive. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt louder than any noise. Arden's breath hung in the air, the fog wrapping around him like a living thing. He scanned the treeline, his flashlight catching only glimpses of the skeletal branches clawing at the gray sky. Then he saw it. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, a tall, spindly figure standing motionless between the trees. Its silhouette was unnaturally long, its head tilted slightly, as though observing him. Arden's flashlight beam trembled as he raised it, but before he could make out any details, the figure stepped back into the shadows, vanishing as if it had never been there. "Who's there?" Arden's voice broke the silence, but the words sounded weak, swallowed by the thick fog. He reached for his sidearm, his hand steady despite the rising panic. Moving cautiously, he circled the shack, the damp leaves muffling his footsteps. His training urged him to stay rational. This was likely an animal or, at worst, someone trying to scare him. But in his gut, he knew this was something else. As he rounded the back of the shack, his light caught something carved into the bark of a nearby tree. He stepped closer, his breath catching when he saw it, the same oval, featureless face from Mark's notebook, etched deep into the wood. Beneath it were tally marks, rows and rows of them, uneven and crude, as though scratched in a frenzy. He counted 10 before stopping, realizing the full number stretched higher than he could reach. A snap of a branch behind him jolted him around, his weapon drawn. But there was nothing, only the swaying of the underbrush, as though something had just moved through it. Arden scanned the area, his every sense on edge, but the woods had returned to their oppressive stillness. He backed away from the carved tree, unwilling to turn his back on the shadows for too long. Something wasn't right about this place. The carvings, the shack, the drawings, they painted a picture he didn't want to understand. Mark had been here, but this wasn't a hiding spot or a simple discovery. The boy had found something he wasn't supposed to. Finally, Arden turned and made his way back to the search party. The woods seemed to press in around him, each step accompanied by the feeling that he was being followed. When he emerged into the clearing where the others had gathered, their flashlights bobbing like distant fireflies, Arden's unease remained. He shared none of what he had seen, not yet. Instead, he handed Mark's shoe to one of the officers and simply said, "He's been here." As the search resumed, Arden's eyes drifted back toward the fog-shrouded woods, to where he knew the shack still stood. Despite his best efforts to focus on the search, his thoughts lingered on the figure in the trees and the faceless symbol carved into the bark. The image wouldn't leave him, and deep down, he knew it wouldn't let him go until the truth was found, no matter how horrific that truth might be. Detective Arden sat in the back of the command post van, a makeshift hub stationed at the edge of the woods. A whiteboard displayed a rough map of the area, with clusters of red XS marking places the search teams had scoured. Mark's shoes sat in a sealed evidence bag on the table beside him, its presence heavy with implications. He couldn't stop thinking about the shack. Its rotting boards and carved markings suggested years of abandonment, yet the shoe and those crude drawings hinted at something recent, something that involved Mark. But none of it made sense. One of the officers entered the van, his face pale beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Detective, we just got a call from a neighbor down the road. Claims they saw the boy 2 nights ago." Arden stood, the words snapping him back into motion. 2 nights? Why are we hearing about this now? Didn't think it was relevant until they saw the news. The officer explained. They said the boy was with someone. Who? A man. Tall, wearing a hooded jacket. Said they saw them walking down the street toward the woods. Arden's mind raced as he absorbed the information. A man. That meant Mark wasn't alone when he went missing. The officer hesitated before adding. The neighbors said they didn't see the man's face, but they were sure the boy looked scared. Arden clenched his jaw. It wasn't unusual for people to come forward late with details that might have been critical earlier. But now, it painted a grim picture. Mark had been led into the woods. Leaving the command post, Arden joined a team preparing to head out. He carried the map from Mark's notebook, which he'd marked with coordinates from the neighbor's report. The clearing with the shack was less than half a mile from where the man and boy had been seen. This time, he brought more officers. As they trudged through the woods, Arden stayed focused on the terrain, looking for anything out of place. Every step brought them closer to the shack. When they arrived, Arden immediately took the team to the back wall. "Check this out," he said, pointing to the carved face and the rows of tallies beneath it. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Looks like some kind of shelter squatters might use," one of them said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Maybe he ran into someone who'd been living out here." But Arden wasn't convinced. He scanned the area again, this time looking for tracks or signs of recent activity. The damp ground yielded little, but near the base of the tree, he noticed a piece of cloth snagged on a jagged root. It was red. He crouched down and carefully retrieved it, holding it up to the light. The fabric matched the description of the shirt Mark had been wearing the day he disappeared. "Bag this," Arden said, passing it to one of the officers. The evidence suggested Mark had been here, but it also confirmed that he hadn't been alone. The presence of the fabric, the shoe, and the carvings created an ominous picture. Someone had brought him here. As the officers began a systematic search of the clearing and surrounding woods, Arden returned to the shack. He stood in the doorway, looking at the debris on the floor and the cryptic drawings on the walls. His eyes lingered on the words scrawled in charcoal. "We found you." A chill ran through him. It felt like more than just vandalism. It felt personal. Turning to leave, Arden paused at the doorway. Something small caught his eye, half hidden beneath a pile of leaves in the corner. He knelt and brushed the debris aside, revealing a child's action figure, a small, plastic soldier. He recognized it from the description Mark's parents had given of his favorite toy. Arden placed it into another evidence bag, his expression grim. The shack wasn't just where Mark had been. It was where he'd been kept. The action figure sat on the evidence table at the command post, its chipped paint and missing arm eerily symbolic of the boy it belonged to. Detective Arden leaned over the table, staring at the plastic toy as if it might offer some hidden revelation. Around him, officers moved with purpose, their chatter blending with the static of radios. The discovery of Mark's possessions confirmed one thing: the boy hadn't wandered off alone. Someone had taken him, and the shack had been their destination. But who? And why? Arden spread the items across the table: the shoe, the scrap of red fabric, and now the soldier. Together, they told a story of deliberate misplacement, breadcrumbs left in the forest, whether intentionally or through haste. He turned to Officer Reyes, who had been tasked with interviewing the neighbor who reported seeing the boy. Did they notice anything else? A car, maybe? Reyes shook his head. They didn't get a good look. Said the fog was too thick. All they remember is the man's silhouette and the direction they were heading. Towards the woods, Arden muttered, his frustration mounting. Before he could dwell further, another officer burst into the command post. Detective, we found something. Arden followed him out to a patrol car where a woman was sitting in the back seat, her hands trembling as she clutched a cigarette. Her clothes were dirty, and her face bore the sunken look of someone who'd spent years battling hard luck and bad decisions. This is Sandra Miller, the officer said. She's a local transient who camps in the woods. Says she might have seen something. Arden crouched to meet her eyes. Ms. Miller, I'm Detective Arden. Can you tell me what you saw? Her voice was hoarse, and her words came in halting bursts. Couple nights ago, I heard something. A kid crying. It was late, maybe around midnight. Thought it was just my mind playing tricks, you know? But then I saw a man walking through the trees, carrying something over his shoulder. Small, like a kid. Arden's stomach tightened. Did you see where he went? She nodded, taking a shaky drag from her cigarette. Toward the old quarry? There's caves out there. People go sometimes, when they don't want to be found. The quarry was about 2 miles deeper into the woods, past where the shack stood. Arden had heard about the caves, a network of jagged tunnels and dark hollows that even seasoned hikers avoided. Why didn't you come forward sooner? He asked, trying to keep the accusation out of his tone. She looked away, shame flickering across her face. Didn't want trouble. Thought maybe it was nothing, but when I saw the news... Her voice broke, and she trailed off. Arden didn't push. The important thing was that they had a lead. Within minutes, the command post buzzed with activity. A team was assembled to head toward the quarry, armed with flashlights, radios, and every ounce of hope they could muster. Arden led the way, Sandra's description replaying in his mind. A man carrying a child. The image stuck to him like tar, dragging his thoughts to the worst possibilities. The fog seemed thicker as they pressed deeper into the woods, as though the forest itself wanted to swallow them whole. The path grew narrower, and soon the ground became uneven, littered with jagged rocks and fallen branches. When they reached the quarry, Arden stopped. The jagged cliffs rose around them like a forgotten scar in the earth. The caves yawned open in the cliffside, dark and uninviting. This is it, he said, his voice low. The team spread out, their flashlights piercing the blackness. Arden took the central cave, its entrance large enough to suggest it went deep. The air was damp and smelled of wet stone and decay. Mark! He called, his voice echoing off the walls. Mark Ellison! For a moment, there was only silence. Then a faint sound reached him, a muffled whimper, so soft he almost thought he'd imagined it. He froze, his heart hammering. I heard something, he shouted to the others. The whimper came again, this time more distinct. Arden moved quickly, his flashlight darting across the uneven walls. The sound led him deeper into the cave, until his light caught something, a small, hunched figure, trembling in the shadows. Mark? He whispered, stepping closer. The boy turned his face toward the light, his wide, terrified eyes meeting Arden's. It was him. Mark was alive, but his condition was dire. He clung to Detective Arden with trembling arms as the officers rushed him to safety. His small body was battered, his clothes torn and caked with dirt, and his muttered words came in fragmented whispers. Arden caught only pieces of what the boy said. "He followed me. He wouldn't let me leave. He said he'd come back." Back at the command post, Mark was swiftly handed over to medics while Arden stayed behind, his mind racing. Mark's rescue was a miracle, but the hunt wasn't over. Whoever had taken the boy was still out there. Arden stared at the map pinned to the whiteboard, his eyes tracing the path from the shack to the quarry. The caves had been used as a hiding spot, but there was no sign of the man. Sandra Miller's description replayed in his head: tall, hooded, carrying something small. Mark's sparse words confirmed what Arden already suspected. The man had planned to come back, maybe to move Mark again. But why? What was the purpose of keeping him alive? Arden couldn't shake the thought that this was more than a random abduction. He focused on the evidence. The carvings at the shack, the drawings in the notebook, the cryptic words. "We found you," they suggested intent. A pattern. This man hadn't acted on impulse. He had a purpose. Later that night, Arden sat with Mark's parents. They were desperate for answers, but Mark's condition meant questioning him had to wait. Arden asked them again about their move to Cranewood, hoping for anything that might connect them to the perpetrator. "It was a fresh start," Mr. Ellison said, his voice hollow. "We didn't know anyone here." Mrs. Ellison wiped at her swollen eyes. "Mark never talked about anyone strange. Just the woods. He said he wanted to explore. The woods. That's where everything circled back." Arden left them and returned to the shack the following morning, this time with a forensic team. They searched the area thoroughly, finding nothing new inside the structure itself. But just outside, buried beneath the rotting leaves, a metal lockbox was unearthed. The lock had rusted over, but inside were photographs, black and white images, old and grainy. Arden spread them on the hood of his car, his pulse quickening as he studied them. Each photo showed children, some sitting on swings, others standing in front of houses or playing in the woods. One image stopped him cold. It was the shack, but in pristine condition, its walls intact, its roof unbroken. A group of children stood in front of it, their faces turned away from the camera. In the doorway, a man loomed tall and spindly, his features hidden by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. Arden flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back, in faded ink, were the words, "We belong to him." The find was a bombshell, but it raised more questions than it answered. Who were these children? And how did this relate to Mark? The photo's age suggested the man had been active for decades. Yet there were no records of similar cases in Cranewood's history. Either the crimes had gone unreported, or this man had chosen his targets carefully. That night, Arden reviewed the case files, piecing together what little they had. Mark's abduction wasn't random. The perpetrator had studied him, lured him, and carried out his plan with precision. The evidence suggested a methodical mind, one who had done this before. The carvings, the drawings, and now the photographs painted a chilling picture. The man wasn't just abducting children. He was claiming them. The photographs were the break Detective Arden needed. Early the next morning, he sat in the Cranewood Police Archive, poring over decades of missing person reports. His gut told him the answers were buried here, hidden in the overlooked and forgotten. By mid-afternoon, a pattern began to emerge. Cases of missing children, scattered across the years, all within a 50-mile radius of Cranewood. Each one was a boy between 6 and 10 years old. The reports were sparse, mostly filed by frantic parents with little to offer except vague descriptions of last sightings. The similarities were striking: children who disappeared without a trace, many last seen near wooded areas. One file caught Arden's attention. Dated 1982, it described a boy named Peter Langley, who had gone missing from a nearby town under circumstances eerily similar to Mark's. Peter had vanished after moving with his family to the area. The report included a witness statement from a neighbor, who claimed to have seen a tall man near the woods the night the boy disappeared. The description was vague: tall, wearing dark clothing, his face hidden by a hat. but it was enough to send a chill through Arden. He pulled more files, each one confirming his growing suspicion. This man had been operating for decades, moving from town to town, always targeting children who were new to the area. But why? That evening, Arden sat in his office, staring at the photo from the lockbox. The man's shadowy figure loomed over the group of children, their faces deliberately obscured. He felt as though the answer was staring back at him, just out of reach. His phone buzzed, breaking his focus. It was Officer Reyes. "Detective, we've got something. Surveillance footage from a gas station 2 towns over. A man fitting the description bought supplies 2 nights ago, same night Mark disappeared." Arden was on the road within minutes. The gas station was small, tucked along a desolate stretch of highway. The manager replayed the footage for him, the grainy video showing a tall man in a dark hooded jacket entering the store. He kept his head down, obscuring his face, but his height and build matched Sandra Miller's description. "Look at this," the manager said, pausing the video as the man exited. He pointed to the back of the man's jacket, where a faint symbol was visible, a circle with intersecting lines through it. Arden leaned closer, his pulse quickening. It wasn't just a design. It was the same symbol carved into the tree at the shack. "Did he say anything?" Arden asked. The manager shook his head. "Barely spoke. Paid cash. Left quick." "Did he drive?" "Yeah, beat up old truck. Plates were caked in mud, couldn't read M." The symbol was the key. Arden was sure of it now. It was more than a marking, it was a signature. Back at the station, Arden began searching through every database he could access. He looked for known offenders, past suspects, and anything tied to the symbol. Hours passed with no leads, frustration mounting until he noticed something buried in an old police memo from 1995. The memo referenced a suspect in a missing child case, a man named Ethan Roy, who had been questioned but never charged. Witnesses had described him as quiet, reclusive, often seen near wooded areas where children played. The investigation stalled when Roy disappeared shortly after the questioning. Arden pulled Roy's records. Born in Cranewood, he'd spent most of his life drifting between small towns. His last known address was a farmhouse on the outskirts of Cranewood, abandoned years ago. Something clicked. Arden grabbed the files and headed out, the farmhouse his next destination. The drive was short but tense. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the twilight. It was a crumbling relic, its windows boarded, its paint long faded. But as Arden approached, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the wooden door, just above the handle, was the same faceless symbol. Detective Arden approached the dilapidated farmhouse with his gun drawn, every nerve on edge. The carved symbol on the door, a faceless circle intersected by lines, seemed to watch him, daring him to step inside. The front door creaked open under the lightest push, revealing a dark interior that smelled of rot and damp wood. Arden's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a hallway cluttered with debris, broken furniture, scraps of paper, and rusted tools. The air was thick with silence, save for the faint creak of the floorboards under his boots. He moved cautiously, sweeping each corner with his light. The farmhouse had been abandoned for years, but the signs of recent activity were unmistakable. In the kitchen, he found a makeshift bed, a thin mattress on the floor, covered with a tattered blanket. Nearby, a lantern sat on a wooden crate alongside cans of food, some recently opened. On the wall above the mattress, more carvings adorned the plaster, hundreds of the same faceless symbols, overlapping and chaotic. Arden's heart pounded as he moved deeper into the house. The back of the kitchen led to a narrow staircase descending into the basement. The steps groaned ominously as he made his way down, the air growing colder with each step. The beam of his flashlight swept across the basement, revealing a space that was part root cellar, part workshop. Tools hung on the walls, their rusted edges glinting in the light. A table sat in the center of the room, its surface littered with items that made Arden's stomach tighten, a child's shoe, a broken toy, and a stack of faded photographs. He moved closer, his hand trembling as he picked up one of the photos. It was of Mark Ellison, taken just days ago. The boy's expression was frozen in fear, his eyes red and swollen. Beside it was another photo, decades older, of a different child, but the setting was the same. Arden flipped through the stack, each image worse than the last. Children of varying ages, all standing in the woods or inside the farmhouse, their faces filled with terror. On the far wall, another discovery awaited. A map of the surrounding area had been pinned up, dotted with pins and scribbled notes. The pins marked locations of disappearances Arden had identified earlier, each one leading back to the farmhouse or the woods. But what caught his attention most was a black circle drawn over a specific part of the map, the quarry. Arden's breath hitched. This man had been planning to return, likely to move Mark or dispose of any evidence. The boy's rescue had disrupted his plans, but it meant the man was now out there, aware that Arden was closing in. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. The faint crunch of gravel came from outside. Arden spun, his flashlight flicking off to avoid giving away his position. He crouched low, his weapon ready, and crept toward the basement stairs. The faint sound of footsteps reached him, deliberate and slow, moving toward the house. As he climbed the stairs, he could hear the front door creak open, followed by heavy, measured breaths. The air seemed to thicken as the intruder stepped inside. Arden positioned himself at the top of the stairs, gun trained on the hallway. The figure moved into view, a tall man in a hooded jacket, his face hidden in shadow. "Cranewood PD!" Arden shouted, stepping into the open. "Don't move!" The man froze, his head tilting slightly, almost curiously. Then, in one swift motion, he bolted toward the back door. "Stop!" Arden yelled, pursuing him through the darkened house and out into the yard. The man moved fast, weaving through the trees with an agility that belied his size. Arden's flashlight bounced wildly as he gave chase, the beam occasionally catching glimpses of the man's hooded figure ahead. As they neared the edge of the woods, the man suddenly stopped and turned. For a brief moment, Arden saw his face, or rather, the lack of one. A smooth, blank oval glared back at him, not inhuman, but distorted by a pale mask. Arden hesitated, the sight freezing him in place. The man used the moment to vanish into the trees, his footsteps fading into the night. The detective stood there, catching his breath, the mask's haunting image burned into his mind. This wasn't over. The man had escaped, but Arden now had everything he needed to track him down. The question was, how many others had worn that mask before him? Detective Arden returned to the station with the farmhouse evidence in tow, his thoughts racing. The photos, the symbols, the mask, it all pointed to a pattern spanning decades, meticulously planned and terrifyingly efficient. The man had been operating under their noses for years, possibly longer, his anonymity protected by the transient nature of his victims. Arden spread the photographs and notes across the conference table, each piece of evidence fitting into a narrative of horror. The man wasn't just abducting children, he was creating a system. Each disappearance was linked by the same unsettling rituals, the carvings, the symbols, and now, the mask. The mask. Arden couldn't get the image out of his mind, the smooth, featureless oval that had stared back at him in the woods. It wasn't just a disguise, it was a statement. Whoever this man was, he had chosen to erase his identity, to become something more than a person, something untouchable. For hours, Arden pored over files and evidence until he noticed a connection he hadn't seen before. Several of the old photographs from the farmhouse bore the same background, the quarry caves. The caves weren't just a hiding place, they were central to the man's actions. By dawn, a new team was assembled to comb the caves thoroughly. Arden led the charge, his determination sharpened by the narrow escape of the masked man. This time, they approached with caution, sealing off the area and covering every crevice. In one of the deeper chambers, they found it, a hidden room carved into the rock. The entrance was obscured by a heavy wooden panel, but inside lay the chilling evidence of the man's crimes. The room was sparse but deliberate. Chains hung from the walls, and the floor was littered with scraps of clothing and toys, remnants of lives cut short. At the center stood a stone altar-like structure, its surface etched with the same faceless symbol that haunted every corner of this case. Arden's chest tightened as he stepped closer, his flashlight sweeping over the carvings. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a shrine. The man wasn't merely abducting children, he was performing rituals, creating a twisted legacy. In one corner of the room, they found a metal trunk. Inside were journals, each filled with neat, precise handwriting. Arden flipped through the pages, his stomach churning as he read. The journals detailed the man's philosophy, a warped ideology that justified his actions. He believed he was saving the children, protecting them from the world by taking them home. The carvings, the mask, the rituals, they were all part of a delusion, a belief that he was part of something larger, an eternal cycle that demanded sacrifices. But the most chilling discovery came in the final journal, dated only weeks ago. The man wrote about Mark Ellison by name, describing the boy as the chosen one. The entry ended with a chilling line. "The mask will endure, even if I do not." Arden realized the horrifying truth. The man didn't see himself as an individual, but as part of a lineage. The mask wasn't just his identity. It was a legacy meant to be passed down. As the team catalogued the evidence, Arden stood in the chamber, the weight of the case pressing down on him. They had uncovered the truth, but the man was still out there, likely preparing to disappear and start again. The mask had escaped justice for decades, its wearers blending into the shadows, striking when the time was right. Arden vowed to end the cycle, to ensure that no other child would become part of this grim legacy. But as he left the quarry, the faint sound of laughter echoed through the caves. It was faint, distant, and yet unmistakable, the laughter of a child. Arden froze, his flashlight darting toward the sound, but the darkness gave nothing back. The laughter faded, leaving only silence, but the unease lingered. Arden knew this case would haunt him forever. The hunt for the masked man consumed the next 48 hours. Every road out of Cranewood was monitored, and surrounding towns were alerted. Yet Arden knew this man's skill at vanishing into the shadows. The farmhouse, the caves, the journals, none of it had been accidental. The man had spent years perfecting his craft. Arden barely slept as he coordinated the search. He pored over the journals again, hoping to find a crack in the man's meticulous plans. Each entry detailed a life lived on the fringes of society, moving from town to town, avoiding patterns that could betray him. But as Arden read the final pages, he noticed something. The man's writing became less confident, the meticulous script giving way to erratic scrawls. One phrase repeated over and over in the final entry. "The mask must live on." Arden knew this wasn't just a delusion, it was a clue. The man was preparing to pass the torch, to find someone new to carry out his legacy. The break came just before dawn. A farmer outside Cranewood reported seeing a stranger camped near his barn. The description was vague, a tall man in a dark jacket, but it was enough. Arden and a team of officers descended on the area, quietly surrounding the barn as the morning light broke through the fog. Inside, the man sat on a hay bale, his hood pulled low over his face. The mask lay beside him, its blank surface gleaming in the dim light. He didn't move as Arden entered, his gun drawn and aimed. "It's over," Arden said, his voice firm. The man lifted his head, revealing a gaunt face marked by years of wear. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was no fear in them. He reached for the mask slowly, his fingers brushing its smooth surface. "The mask will never die," he said, his voice calm, almost serene. "Drop it," Arden ordered, stepping closer. The man's lips curled into a faint smile. "You think this ends with me? It doesn't. You'll see." In one swift motion, the man raised the mask as though to place it on his face. Arden fired, the shot echoing through the barn. The man collapsed, the mask falling from his grasp and clattering to the floor. As officers moved in to secure the scene, Arden stood over the body, his eyes fixed on the mask. It was an ordinary object, plastic, cheaply made, but in its blankness, it carried decades of horror. The aftermath was a blur of reports and press briefings. The farmhouse and quarry were combed for evidence, and families of long missing children were contacted. Arden knew the case would make headlines for weeks, but he found little comfort in the closure. 1 week later, Arden visited Mark Ellison in the hospital. The boy was recovering, but his eyes carried a weight far beyond his years. He clung to his parents as Arden spoke to them, reassuring them that the man responsible was gone. As Arden turned to leave, Mark spoke for the first time since being rescued. "He's not gone," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "He said he'd come back." Arden froze, the boy's words cutting through him like a blade. He forced a reassuring smile and left the room, but Mark's words stayed with him. Months later, Arden's work on the case was complete, but the mask still haunted him. It sat in an evidence locker, lifeless yet potent. He considered destroying it but hesitated. The mask wasn't just an object, it was a symbol of the darkness that lingered in the world. One night, unable to sleep, he returned to the station and opened the locker. He stared at the mask, its blank surface seeming to stare back. He felt an unease he couldn't shake, as though the mask carried a life of its own. With a deep breath, he sealed the locker and walked away, leaving the mask in the darkness. But as he turned off the lights, he couldn't help but feel that its story wasn't over. Somewhere, in another town, a child might wander too far into the woods. And someone might be waiting, ready to bring the mask back to life.